Welcome to the Respectability webinar, Embracing Change and Breaking Down Silos to Achieve Maximum Results. Your speaker for today's program is Marty Linsky, a faculty member at Harvard Kennedy School. Audiocast quality is subject to your equipment, available bandwidth, and internet traffic. If you experience unsatisfactory audio quality, please use the telephone dial-in option provided in your confirmation and reminder emails. If you have dialed in, operator assistance is available by pressing £0. Missing questions at any time by using the chat window located to the left corner of the presentation screen. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. Handouts for today's program can be downloaded using the program materials link in your confirmation and reminder emails or from the documents folder on the lower right corner of the presentation screen. The quality of today's live webcam stream is dependent on your internet network connection speed and computer hardware. Please close down any unnecessary internet accessing applications, and we strongly recommend being hardwired to the internet if your wireless connection is fair. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the call over to our moderator and speaker, Jennifer Laszlo-Mizrahi, President of Respectability USA. Please begin.
Hello and welcome. We're so delighted that you joined us for this webinar. This webinar is really going to go through some meaty issues that are complicated as we're dealing with trying to get better performance metrics for people with disabilities. And that's the issues of change and breaking down silos and getting the attention of the right bosses and the governor and the other people who really control the budgets and the timelines and everything. So I'm really delighted to have such an expert speaker. Marty Linsky is the author or co-author of more than a dozen books or chapters, including The Art and Practice of Adaptive Leadership, Leadership on the Line, and other outstanding pieces on leadership. In the link here, you can see a link to his Amazon page where you can buy any books that you might be interested in. I've actually read, I think, all of his books or many of his books and found them really, really helpful in my work, and that's why I wanted to have him on with us today. He taught at the Harvard Kennedy School since 1982, except for 92 to 95 when he was Chief Secretary to Massachusetts Governor William Weld. He's a graduate of Williams College and Harvard Law School. Linsky's been a journalist, a lawyer, a politician. He served as minority leader of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, as a reporter for the Boston Globe, and editor of Real Paper. Listen, he is just a really smart guy. He also happens to be a really nice guy. I was very privileged to have him be my coach for years. And so I turn it over so that we can see Marty's face. Operator, if we can turn it so we can see Marty. Marty, welcome to joining us.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here and to work with you again.
Well, it's delightful to have you, and I know that this is not your issue set. You don't work day-to-day on the disability set of issues. What you work on are helping people think through big problems that need new solutions. And so let me start off by just observing something that I thought was pretty interesting, and that was that when we sent out the invitation for the webinar, we sent it out to governors and to people from all kinds of different streams of public life that have to do with workforce development, workforce boards, workforce agencies. But most of the people who signed up for the webinar are people who have been working with people with disabilities for a long time, whether they're in vocational rehabilitation or whether they work for a nonprofit that's really devoted to employment of people with disabilities. So first of all, how do we capture the imagination and attention of the other stakeholders who have really something to contribute and some place to be held accountable to look at these issues?
Well, it's a great observation, Jennifer, and I must say I'm not very surprised to hear that, because what we've done today is replicate the problem. The sign up for this webinar mirrors the problem in the larger community, which is that for most people in government and public affairs, what the law says notwithstanding, as far as they're concerned, the issues around people with disabilities are someone else's problem. They haven't had to deal with it. They've been avoiding dealing with it for a long time, and that's the way they prefer it to be. So not joining on this webinar is both a manifestation and also a metaphor for a much deeper problem that you're trying to deal with. I don't think it's surprising at all.
So how do we go about addressing that? And actually, before you even answer that question, just as an observation of somebody who's worked with a lot of governments on a lot of different policy issues, why do you think it is that we have not moved the needle on employment for people with disabilities?
Well, there's a lot of serious research about this, and I'm not an expert at it. But just looking from the outside, I was actually on the board of the Jewish Vocational Service 30, 40 years ago in Boston. So I remember some experience in dealing with some of the similar kinds of issues a long, long time ago. But thinking about it from a broader perspective of leadership and change, it seems to me we have to start with the proposition that the way things are now are the way people want them to be. So the level of attention that workforce agencies and state governments have paid to people with disabilities up to now is the way they want it to be. The current reality is not an accident. People are busy, people have their priorities. The work with people with disabilities, my observation, is uncomfortable for people. It challenges their own expertise. They're afraid if you're a big manager that you'll be incompetent. You're not sure how to deal with people who are blind or are in wheelchairs. There's lots of discomfort that is associated with this, and it's why people are ignoring the challenges, because people want to stay where they feel confident and comfortable. Particularly, you're trying to approach people at very high levels of authority, governors and department heads and senior staff people. And for them, you're pushing them into a space where their own sense of their own expertise is challenged.
So how do you deal with that issue of approaching a leader about an issue where they don't feel they have expertise, and frankly, they've got other priorities that they'd rather be dealing with than your issues?
Well, my own experience and observation is that there are two basic ideas here. One is that you have to deal with people experientially. That is, facts are not really compelling. The facts may be relevant, but they're not controlling. So giving people lots and lots of information, more facts and more for ideas, the people who are going to be moved by that are already moved. They're already with you. They're already helping and collaborating. But clearly there aren't enough of them who are going to be persuaded by the facts and the information. So you're really talking about two other things. If you want to take a book out of the gay marriage movement playbook, for example, there are two pieces that were really important, I think, to the success over the last decade. The first is they forced people to experience the reality that they were talking about. So my assumption is that there are lots of people in senior authority positions that are really important to you who have never spent time working collaboratively dealing with people with disabilities in a professional setting. Their only exposure to people with disabilities is in protected settings in some non-work situation. So it is really critical that they begin to break down their discomfort and lack of experience. And there are lots and lots of ways of doing that. But that's one idea, is that putting people face to face with the experience is a critical piece. The second piece, which is related but different, I mean, you're one of the best politicians I know, Jennifer, so I think you probably understand this better than most people. But you've got to push people beyond where they feel comfortable. So what you did, and I'm not saying this in any way critical making a value judgment of it, just a descriptive mechanism. You invited all these people by the same invitation route. And the people who signed up were the people who were already committed. So what that says to me is that you've got to, in order to get people to sign up for this webinar, you've got to use invitation routes which are out of the norm. 20 phone calls to a governor's office would have produced some staff person on this webinar, because they would have begun to say, and the only way to get Jennifer off my back is to say yes. Now, a lot of people, particularly my experience, is people who are doing God's work, who are mission-driven. They don't get up in the morning and say, how can I make my governor and his staff feel uncomfortable today? I'm in the business of helping, not making people uncomfortable. I'm in the business of making people comfortable, about doing good. I'm not in the business of making trouble. But leading deep change, which is the business you are in, is a disruptive activity. And in order for you to make more progress than you've made in the past, you're going to have to disrupt people who are comfortable with the way they've been doing business for a long, long time. A change in the law is not enough. There has to be changes that you can use the law to help you force change, and they can use the law to tell their people why they have to change. But in order to get people metaphorically and literally to sign up for this webinar, you have to do something more than just send them an invitation.
So what's an example from your work or something you've observed where someone was trying to make social change and they were able to get that kind of attention that we could translate into this problem that we're trying to solve?
Well, of course, again, this is bringing coals to Newcastle, because if someone else asked me that question, I'd say call Jennifer, because she understands that business as well as anybody else. But I'm thinking now, when you ask that question, of a woman who we both know, whose passion is gender equity. She's devoted her life to gender equity, and she has done it without having a big job, without any having formal responsibility, without running a large organization. But she's made enormous progress by using whatever tools she needed to use in order to make progress. One of the things that constrains people, particularly people in mission-driven situations, is their resistance to using tools and tactics which make them feel uncomfortable, never mind make others feel uncomfortable. So the willingness to be get into somebody's face, to be relentless, to be a pain in the neck, to bring 20 people to a meeting instead of bringing one person to a meeting, to not take no for an answer. All those kinds of behaviors which, quote, nice people don't do, are really necessary when all the nice things that you try to do aren't successful. So I want to use this, because it's our live case today, I want to use this webinar as a metaphor for that. Because if everybody on this webinar, everybody who had signed up for this webinar, had made 2 or 3 visits to someone they think would benefit from this experience, who had not been involved with disabilities but would be useful to workforce development for people with disabilities going forward, if everyone who had signed up, the 130 or 140 people who had signed up for this webinar, if each of them had gone and made several visits to a couple of people that they wanted to come, that number would have been much higher, and people would be involved in this conversation who hadn't been involved before. Does that help? Does that make sense?
It does, and actually, Marty, as we've been approaching this issue with the governors ourselves, and I've met one-on-one with 40 of the governors, is we have been very pushy in trying to get meetings with them and tried to be also very polite to them at the same time. We gave them good information, but at the end of the day, the most important selling tool for us was to get the governor to do a site visit to a location where employees with disabilities helped the employer make money. that ultimately the big sell for us was the eyewitness account that took away the pity frame. That it wasn't, oh, look how I'm helping poor Johnny who has these different challenges in his life. Oh, this sad person, this employer took them in, and now isn't that nice that he can afford to go to McDonald's? But instead went to the employers for whom it was meeting their business growth needs, their business survival and profit needs, and that bringing governors to visit those sites like Scott Walker of Wisconsin, who has visited many of them, like Governor Jack Markell, who didn't need anyone to ask him but went on his own, but other governors to do the site inspection. So I guess my biggest advice then would be for the people on this call to think about what are the places in your area where it is meeting the needs of the employers, and it is something that can be replicated. So you don't want it to be a place where, a guy's got a small business, he's employing one person with a disability, the business is not going to be expanding, the situation is so unique. You want to be taking a look at a large federal contractor who has legal obligations to hire, or you want to look at somebody who's got a growing business and it can be replicated in many places. Is that what you're thinking, Marty?
No, let me actually put it in a slightly broader frame, Jennifer, because what you're saying is those folks, those governors who made those site visits are not doing it because they care about people with disabilities. They're doing it because they care about reducing unemployment in Delaware and Wisconsin. So you're not asking them to buy into your issue. You're buying into their issue. And that's a real difference, because part of the problem here is sometimes we want people to do the right thing for the same reason we're doing the right thing. And the people who are going to do the right thing for the same reason are already doing it. So the only way to approach people for whom this has not been a high priority is to say to yourself, well, what is their high priority? What do they care about? What's important to them? We're heading into an election year. So what that means is that for a lot of governors and a lot of state legislators, what's important to them is getting votes, right? And getting votes is something that people who care about people with disabilities can help them do, right? So they're not going to commit themselves during an election year to doing something that they haven't been willing to do because it's the right thing. They're going to commit themselves during an election year to doing what they haven't been doing because it's going to help them do what they want to do in an election year, which is get elected, right? So I would encourage people, I think your example is a really good example, because what you're saying is, look, I'm not trying to convince them that this is a good thing. I'm trying to convince them that I can help them achieve what they're trying to achieve, right? So this is not about Governor Markell's caring about people with disabilities. This is not about Governor Walker caring about people with disabilities. This is about Governor Markell and Governor Walker caring about their priorities, which are to reduce unemployment in their states. And it's a very big leap, and it's particularly, in my experience, it's particularly a difficult leap for people who are so mission-driven, right? Is to say, look, I'm not going to try to convince them that they should do this because it's the right thing to do. I'm going to convince them that I can help them achieve something they want to achieve, right? That's a big difference. And for some people, that's very hard.
Well, I'm really glad you raised that about the voters. I mean, we just actually today put out the press release about our new blog, the Respectability Report on the presidential candidates. If you look at the last presidential cycle, Mitt Romney never talked about employment for people with disabilities. We've been meeting with the candidates and reaching out to them and asking them to talk about it. And we're seeing that this time, both sides of the aisles are starting to talk about these issues. We've got a Twitter hashtag, which is hashtag PWDs, that's People with Disabilities Vote, PWDs Vote, that is really our campaign on this. and we're blogging on this. So that can help with a governor that's up for re-election. But in many cases, it's not the political person, it's the civil servant. It's the person who's the head of the workforce board or the workforce agency. It's the person who's the Secretary of Transportation, Labor, or Healthcare. All of these people are supposed to, according to the new WIOA law, be sitting together on an advisory committee to make this new plan for their state. So how do you suggest that the people from the disability community, whether they're an individual advocate or a disability organization or they're voc rehab, how do they use this opportunity of the legal structure that they're supposed to be these meetings of this task force to come up with a statewide workforce strategy as a way to really create success for our population?
Well, I think you should probably be meeting with their general counsels, and saying to them, this is the law, and your boss has not been very compliant with the law, and we really don't want to see a story in the front page of the newspaper that says that your boss is avoiding complying with the law and helping people with disabilities, but you're beginning to leave us, no choice, right? Because now that you've got this piece of leverage, the question is, how do you use it? Because if I'm a department head, the Department of Health or Department of Labor or something, I've got a full plate. I'm working very hard. I'm doing important work. And you are a virus. You're intruding into that. And so you've got to make me pay attention in some way, right? I know all about people with disabilities. I know enough, right? But you've got to find a way to get my attention in a way that you haven't been able to do in the past. And I think the law gives you some leverage. It doesn't solve the problem, right? I'm a lawyer, or I was trained as a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I wouldn't never pay me for my legal advice. But I went to law school, and I passed the bar, and I've got the degree. The law doesn't change anything. It's the implementation of the law that changes something. So you've got the law on the books, that's a great start, but putting that, giving life to that, breathing life into it means that if I'm the head of the Department of Labor or the Commissioner of Health, I've got to do something different than what I've been doing, right? And it means that something that I've been doing is not going to be as high a priority as I want it to be. So you are forcing people to change their priorities. And it's not because they're good people or bad people. It's because they've figured out how to survive and thrive in the context that they're in, and you're adding a new element to it. So I think you've got to use some less than conventional ways of getting their attention. That's why I think meeting with the legal counsels, which is just the first thought that came to my head, would be a good start, because you want that legal counsel to go into his or her boss and say, unless we begin to play well with others on this issue, we're going to get some very bad press, and then our governor is going to go ballistic. Does that make sense?
It does, but interestingly, I don't think we have to go with the legal threat in many cases, because in many cases the governors want to do the right thing. We met with them, they've asked their staff to do the right thing, but they're completely unused to working outside of their silo. Or working in collaboration. So walk us through, let's assume the best intentions of a group of people. You've got Education Secretary, Labor Secretary, Transportation Secretary, voc rehab, they're all in the same room. How do you work on an issue to help these groups break down their silos and succeed?
Well, I think that the best way to understand it is that the problems are not in the room. Look at I hesitate to mention this subject knowing you and your passions, but you look at the Iran nuclear negotiations. It was not hard to figure out what an agreement could look like. I think the same thing is true in the Middle East. It's not hard to figure out what an agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the State of Israel might look like. Those are technical problems. Experts can figure that out. The problem in the negotiations with Iran were that the American side and the Iranian side had to deal with their people back home. That was the problem. The problem is not the technical agreement. The problem is the politics back home. I think that's just as true in the Middle East as it was in the Iranian nuclear negotiation as it is in the situation you're describing. So you put those people around a table, they can work out a comprehensive plan. It's not very hard, right? It's very simple. It's very straightforward. I mean, there are issues and they have to be sorted out, but it's not a technically complex problem. What is a problem is when they go back to their people and say, you know, these 3 people that have been working on this issue for the last 5 years, now they're going to have to stop working on it because I signed them up to work on disabilities. I signed them up to work on this collaborative effort. I signed them up to change the way we deal with people in sheltered settings. I don't know, you know. But that's where it's a problem. So the conversation is not about what a good plan would look like for Delaware or Wisconsin or Massachusetts or New York or anywhere. The problem is, how do we help the people around the table deal with the mess that we've created for them by creating this agreement? So much less time needs to be spent on an agreement than if we have an agreement, what problems is this going to cause for you? Because I think it is fantasy, it's an illusion to think that this is going to be a win-win. When anybody tells me it's going to be a win-win, then I know nothing really important is going to happen. Because there are going to be some people who are going to experience this collaboration as a threat or a loss. And that's what holds back this kind of change. That's what keeps people in their silo. People like to do the work they know how to do. Who doesn't like, particularly when you move up the food chain in an organization, who doesn't like to be competent? And you're asking people to do something that they're not as sure they're going to be good at as what they're doing now. And that's very threatening to people. So what you're trying to do, while it looks obvious and unquestionably a good thing, the people who are pushing back, who are not collaborating, it's not because they don't understand what you're trying to do. And it's not because they don't even think intellectually it's a good idea. It's not because they don't get it. It's because they do get it and they don't like it. Now, they can't say they don't like it, because how can you say, I'm against the law and I'm against people with disabilities? Nobody can say that. So the manifestation of it, again, using our metaphor, is not signing up for the webinar. Then they don't have to deal with it. Does that make sense?
So let me concretize that a little bit, if you don't mind. So imagine you've got a great program that has been operating for a long time in a state for people who've come out of prison. Now, they serve people coming out of prison, and a lot of those people, they have mental health issues. But they're not dealing with the mental health issues of the individuals. They're just sort of putting them in the, we don't want to see recidivism, and therefore we're trying to get them a job category. And now you're coming along and you're saying, well, we've got to put a disability lens on this conversation. So what might the conversation look like to try and make people feel less threatened and more embracing of thinking through some change that might get some better outcomes?
Well, it depends, Jennifer, on who you're talking to. Because one of the things about this business of deep change is that it's not a wholesale business, it's a retail business. So you tell me who you're talking to, and I'll tell you how to deal with them, because it goes back to what we're saying before. It's not about you and your issue, it's about them and their issues. And so you've got to understand what's important to them, what they care about, in order to make progress where you haven't been made before when you're asking them to shake up their own priorities. So it depends who you're talking to. So give me an example of someone who you'd be talking to.
Well, you know what, let me turn it over to our audience a bit to let them start writing in some problems that they're having. I mean, maybe people can write in now, all of you who are listening, if you want to type in a situation that you're facing where you'd like some ideas for how to deal with it. Operator, you want to give any instructions on how to do that, if you would?
Yes, to submit a chat message, please simply just type in your message at the bottom of the chat window and hit enter on your keyboard.
So while we're waiting for that, I think there's a lot of different levels, Marty, of who that person might be. I mean, at some point it might be, the budget people who put together the budget who were saying, I recognize that if we get people with disabilities into work, that it reduces the amount of cost to the federal government in their disability benefits, but at the expense to solve the problem comes from the state budget. And why should the state budget spend money to save money from the federal budget, for example? That's something that I know a lot of issues face. What are your thoughts on that issue?
No, I think that's a very tough one, because if they're making a rational calculation that from a budget perspective is going to cost the state, net cost the state money to do what you want them to do, then saving money is not going to be a good argument, and they're not going to be the right people to start with, because that's their highest value is creating a balanced budget. And that means using all the federal dollars they can get and saving all the state dollars they can find to save. So it seems to me the budget people are probably not the right people to approach, unless you should happen to find that a budget director or an associate budget director has a family member who has a disability, in which case they're going to look at the issue quite differently than if that were not the case. So the first thing I would want to know, if the budget is a really critical leverage place for you, the first thing I would want to know is to survey the budget directors and the associate budget directors and see if any of them have had any personal experience with people with disabilities and what that has been like. What have they brought from that? Because again, it's not going to be on the merits, and I think you're quite right to identify that as a challenge if they see from their value set, which is saving money, that this is not a good deal, or that it's a good deal in the long run but not in the short run, so it won't happen on their watch.
Well, one thing that we saw that was really exciting was that the state of Wisconsin has invested in some youth employment programs like Project Search and some other things that are very successful, and they were able to get enough people off benefits that they tapped into what was almost like a reward program from the federal government, that they spent money, the money caused people to get off benefits, and the federal government wound up sending them $4 million for the state, basically a very big thank you prize for saving the federal government so much money. And that wound up being a really good way to go for them. And I think that their vocational rehabilitation director in Wisconsin deserves a lot of credit for figuring out how to spend money wisely to help people get off benefits, so then they could get the money back for the state, which really helped a lot.
And again, the point here, which I think is really the central idea, is that it's not about getting people to care more about people with disabilities. It's about understanding what people do care about and fitting this issue into what they care about. So if you could say to people there's a pot of federal money which you can access if you do these 4 things, which is what I want you to do, but I don't want you to do it because of the federal money. I want you to do it because it's the right thing to do. But if I can get you to do it because of the federal money, that's fine, right? We don't care why people do the right thing from our perspective. We want them to do the right thing. And the people who are going to do the right thing because it's the right thing are already doing it.
Right.
So the people we're looking at are people who the merits really are not convincing. But saying to them, hey, you care about money, and there's a pot of federal money here which you could access if you would do these 4 things, that's going to make some difference to them.
Right, right. So Barbara W. is asking, how do you find out what businesses have federal contracts? And actually, I know the answer to that, which is really a wonderful magic secret answer, which is that there's a website called fedspending.org, I believe it is, but we have for every single state, we have a PowerPoint that's on our website under Resources for Policymakers, and there's a page that talks about the federal contractors in each state. And interestingly, this nonprofit organization, I think it's fedspending.org, because they were concerned about different issues, like Marty's talking about how sometimes you have to use somebody else's agenda to help yours. their agenda is that they're worried about sort of bribery in government. Who are all these federal contractors making donations to politicians? So they created a website through the government that shows every single federal contract in the country broken down by congressional district. So if you are the ARC or you are Goodwill or you're Voc Rehab and you want to know who are the federal contractors in my neighborhood that have these new 503 obligations to hire people with disabilities, believe it or not, there is a website that links to every single name of every single business in your congressional district that has a federal contract. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether that contract is for $1 billion for a contract in Washington with Lockheed Martin or whether it's a $50,000 contract. So long as the contract's for $50,000 for any part of the company, it has to do with 100% of the company. And so you can always go into it and you can just type in the name of the company. It has a search feature and you can see maybe they don't have the contract for something being done in your congressional district. Maybe it's happening through their parent company in Washington, but you can see whether they have those 503 obligations. And it's really a wonderful tool to figure out what federal contractors have those obligations through the 503. However, if they have the obligation, but there's no public transportation to that company, you've got a problem. So now, Marty, you've got a problem that federal contractor X, Lockheed Martin, or the Marriott Corporation, or Hilton, or somebody is really near by, but not on public transportation. So how do you take that to go to the silos, Marty, and deal with getting the Department of Transportation to maybe adjust a bus route or look at other issues like that?
No, I mean, I'd first see what their legal obligations are or aren't. I'd try to see what the public transportation agency's record is with hiring people with disabilities themselves, because my assumption is that they are pretty good at hiring people with disabilities, that they're going to be more sensitive to the issue, and in fact, if you could organize the people with disabilities that work for them, that would help them be even more sensitive to it. Again,
wait a minute, that's an interesting thought. Wait, I have to interrupt you. I have never heard anybody give that idea, to organize the employees with disabilities within an organization beyond being in an erg where they talk about just sort of their own personal workplace challenges, but you're saying to essentially start an advocacy amongst their own employees?
Of course, right. Now, they're not going to, I mean, if you went to them first and said, why don't you extend this bus route to Lockheed Martin so these people could take the route, and they said, no, we can't do that, it doesn't fit with our long-range plan, whatever excuses they gave, then that might be a second step. I wouldn't start with that, but that might be a second step. I would think for any of these public agencies that you're talking about, that they're one of the most powerful tools that you have is the people with disabilities that they've already hired. Not only because they see the capacities and potential for doing great work, but also because they are beholden to those people, and they are loyal to them, and those people are going to have more influence on them than some outside advocate who's banging on their door.
That's interesting. I think the initial perception might be, oh, the person with disability who's in the workplace is sort of watching out for their own self-interest and not ready yet to carry somebody else's water.
And that may be true. I mean, that's the issue that people who are fighting for gender equity face all the time, that women who have made it to the top in the organization think that their job is done, and they don't want to use any of their political capital to try to help other women. But that's something that you can help people move beyond. And my experience in the gender equity issue is that there's a enormous potential in that. Yes, it does mean putting yourself out there a little bit. But, Jennifer, that's what we're talking about. I mean, that's, again, I don't want to keep harping on it, but it is today's case, and it's so useful. If everybody who had signed up for this webinar had pushed themselves to go beat up on somebody who they wanted to come and listen to this webinar, who they needed to collaborate with, there would be a lot of those people there. Right? And so it requires everybody, all of us involved in this, to do things a little bit differently than they otherwise would do. Right? Because if you keep doing the same behavior, nothing is going to change. Right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The only people we can deal with are the 140 people, or whatever the number is, who are involved in this webinar. And for each of us to do something differently, now, I mean, I'll give you another case on today's case, you know. I would not have done this if you hadn't asked me. Right? I don't spend a lot of time doing pro bono work for anybody, but you are a very hard person to say no to. And if I said, no, I'm busy on this particular Tuesday, you would have said, when are you not busy? Right? And you would have been after me until I said yes. And your willingness to do that is what's made you such a great change agent. So that the constraints on making more progress than we've made in the past on workforce development for people with disabilities are sitting right on this webinar. They're all of us. Right?
But I'm in a much easier place because I'm an outside activist as opposed to somebody on state payroll. So how does somebody on state payroll or working for one of the larger, more established, the ARC or Goodwill or something, how do they go about really pushing this when they're always worried about their own funding and their own survival of their agency?
Well, they've got some advantages. I think the short answer, the glib answer, is very carefully. But they've got some advantages, too, because in the same way that people with disabilities sometimes make other people uncomfortable, they also appeal to people's better nature. So I never encourage anybody to try to do this alone, and I would never encourage anybody to start by organizing a wheelchair demonstration outside of the governor's house. But there are lots of things you can do short of that which minimize the risk and danger that you will be marginalized or punished in some way. And part of it is not doing it alone, right? Not trying to be a lone wolf and a hero, but looking for people who are similarly situated who could speak the same song. And because you have lots of people singing it, it's a much more powerful song than if you're singing it alone. So I agree with you. I mean, we all make those calculations. We all make risk calculations that are perfectly reasonable. What we're asking everybody on this webinar to do is to push that boundary just a little bit to see if you can make a little bit more progress than you have in the past.
So Sheldon is asking, so let's say we did this. He's asking, if each of us here today on the webinar was to reach out to two other people and get them on this call, what would those two other people hear that would move them to action?
Well, they would hear something about that we understand, we advocates understand that if you do what we're asking you to do, it's going to cause you some problems. And so we'd like to understand what those problems are to see if we can help you with. Because I think one of the important pieces of trying to lead deep change is being empathetic. Because people who are advocates too often are so focused on their advocacy and their commitment that they are talking past the people they're trying to influence. So I want to know from people who are in that situation, what's important to them, what do they care about, why haven't they, what are they afraid of, what will happen if they were to be more collaborative with the other workforce-related agencies on behalf of people with disabilities. I want to understand their problems. And if I were an advocate, that's where I would start. And I think that message to them is that we're not asking you to do this because it's the right thing, because it says so in the Bible, and because God will punish you if you don't. But we're asking people to do this because we can help them with some problems that they have. is the way to start making progress with people who have been resistant today.
So let's go back to that federal contractor. Let's imagine that Marriott, Hilton, or whatever hotel that needs to hire people to clean hotel rooms and to do kitchen prep, and you've got a group of people coming out of school who have autism spectrum disorder or Down syndrome or something that could make great employees for them. They could be great to have a project search site there, but they're not on the public transportation route, and you want to go to the mayor's office, whoever controls the bus, and you want to say to them, we want to have the bus stop go here, and what problems does that cause for you? How do you have that? Do you want to bring somebody with a disability with you to that meeting? How would you sort of think about that conversation?
Well, the first thing I would want to do is figure out who else would benefit that has nothing to do with disabilities for extending that bus route to the Lockheed Martin plant. Who else would benefit from that? Who lives around there? Who needs to get there for other purposes? And then because I would want to see if there's actually a coalition of people who have a shared interest in the bus route, even if they don't have a shared interest in disabilities. So I went to saw the mayor's people. I would do so not alone, but representing a whole coalition of people who had some interest. Second thing I'd want to do before I went and saw the mayor about the bus routes is I'd go back to the point I made before. I'd want to know if anybody on the mayor's staff is a person with disabilities, anybody he or she has appointed to a senior position is a person with disabilities. I'd want to know by asking around if the mayor or anybody on his or her staff has a relative who has disabilities. I want to know as much of that information as possible to know whether there is anybody who they listen to who has personal experience with the situation, and if so, what's that personal experience? It may be useful, maybe it could be not useful, but I want to have that information when I go there. Another thing is I want to know what the history is of extending bus routes, right? Has this been a big issue in the city, or is it a non-issue in the city? Have they done it with big public hearings and lots of publicity, or has it been done quietly? I want to know how this issue has been addressed. Again, it's not about convincing people to do the right thing. It's about trying to understand the context in which you are stepping into so you can make the moves that are most likely to achieve success. I'd want to find out who I would want to have at that meeting from the mayor's side. Who are the people who are likely to be most receptive? If there's a person on his staff or in the city agency that deals with people with disabilities, I want to make sure that person was an advocate for extending the bus route first. Because if I'm the mayor and I have a person who I identify on my staff as a person who knows about the subject or deals with the subject, and that person isn't for extending the bus route, no way it's going to happen. Whatever else is going on, right? If that's my person and he's the only person, it's just like, as women know, as gay people know, if you're a senior woman in a male-dominated organization and a gender equity issue comes up, the CEO calls you up and says, you know, you're my highest-ranking woman, what do you think about this? And that's going to be hugely influential. So I'd want to know a lot before that meeting took place.
That's super helpful. Let me think of another situation that I think is pretty common, which is this issue of youth employment. The new law puts a lot of funding in youth employment, but it seems that a lot of areas are doing it the easy way. They're just saying, okay, well, we're going to just do summer jobs, cookie cutter summer jobs. And we'd like to see something else. We'd like to see apprenticeships at these companies that are hiring, where people with disabilities would do a great job for them. We'd like to see project search programs that are more ongoing. We'd like to see ongoing job coaches, so a young person doesn't just have a short training and then nothing, go cold turkey. So we'd like to see something that's more intelligent than just throwing the money at summer jobs. So how would we think about talking to the people who control the mayor's summer job program to think about being more strategic in terms of their investments?
If I'm controlling the summer jobs program, I probably don't have enough money to feed the demand, right? So my metric for doing a good job is getting all the money out the door, and that's pretty easy to do. So you come and you say to me, well, why don't we spend it a different way? And this is going to be different and new and smart. And I'm going to say, hey, you know, I got plenty of to do. This is a pain in the ass to get this this money out the door. I'm already going to disappoint a whole bunch of people. You want me to disappoint more people with your cockamamie idea? No, I'm not interested. Now, let's say that the mayor has, or the governor has a donor who also runs an apprenticeship program at his or her company, right? And he is already excited about the idea of turning a summer jobs program into an apprenticeship program because he cares about his industry, right? So I'd have that person approach the mayor first and say, you know, I got a great idea for how you can have a more creative use of that summer job money, and by the way, I think it's also going to help our unemployment rate, and by the way, on and on and on, right? And then the mayor calls the summer jobs person and says, you know, I'd like to take a portion of that money. Well, you get the idea, right? But it's not, when you go to someone whose job it is to get that money out the door, he doesn't want, or she doesn't want another new idea, because they've already, their problem is not getting the money out the door. Their problem is disappointing all the people who they don't have enough money to fund.
Right,
so
right.
So it's a different way. Right. Again, it's this idea of it's not about the merits. It's about the human dynamics and the small p politics around the issue. That's what's going to make progress.
So, operator, I'd like to encourage people again to be asking questions. I just got in a long question, so let me actually read this one. David is asking, one of the challenges we face is that there are so many actors in the existing system at the federal, state, and local level, as well as multiple private entities, that make it hard to innovate. On top of that, there is an additional fear to implement any type of innovation that might potentially cause harm, which would wind up in the media. While the do no harm principle is laudable, we don't fully understand how the current system causes harm, which leaves us stuck without officials who are perhaps rightfully afraid of taking risks to make change. With that context, how can we develop messages, either in print or through meetings like this one, to convince the entities in this complicated system to get over the fear of failure and to recognize that failure might lead to an idea that is innovative? Do we have evidence on the types of interactions or the combinations of interactions that are most effective?
Well, it's a great question, because the public sector and the civil service system is set up to encourage risk-averseness, right? It's designed for people who are risk-averse or who learn to be risk-averse once they get there. So that's a very deep value, and you can understand that. Taxpayers don't want their money spent in ways that are unproductive. So how do you deal with that? Well, one of the ways historically that we've dealt with that in the public sector is by the ruse, and I use that word carefully, by the ruse of pilot programs. Pilot programs are a way to innovate, but you know, it's a camel under the tent, because everybody who's pushing a pilot program frames it as an experiment, but in reality they're trying to deliver a service to a group of people that they are confident is going to work, and they know that once it does, everybody else is going to insist on it well, and the senior political people are going to say, we've got to do this for everybody. Right? So I find in the work that I do, particularly in public sector situations, that using the language of pilot project or an experiment, or we're going to test a hypothesis, or we're going to do something for a short period of time and see if it works, is a way to introduce innovation. Right? It's lower the risk, lower the threat, because I think the questioner is right. The chances of the risk of it coming back or being on the front page of the paper if it doesn't work leads people to reduce their risk tolerance to almost zero. So you've got to find a way to soften that risk. So there are other ways of doing it. One of the ways is the way you suggested, which is to say if there's a pot of money that they can access by doing an innovation, then that takes some of the pressure off of them. Then they can say, look, there's this money sitting here and it goes to waste if we don't, and at least we can try something. If they have people on an advisory committee who are well established in the community, who are advising them on this innovation, that can cushion the blow if something doesn't go all that well. There are lots of things you can do, but again, to think about it in those political terms, small p political terms, rather than think about here's a project which would be good, why can't we get them to innovate and try it? There's a reason that they won't try it, which is the reason that the questionnaire identifies.
Well, we're looking for more questions so people can type in more questions, but we've been focusing a lot on how to talk about external stakeholders. But how do we talk about looking for change within our own organizations? Because, you know, even voc rehab organizations or organizations that are agencies trying to get people with disabilities jobs, how do they look at their own strengths or weakness? How do they evaluate what they should do more of, what they should do less of?
Well, I think that it's not a dissimilar problem. That is, the current reality is not an exact accident. The way things are the way people want them to be. I don't think there's any such thing as a dysfunctional family or a dysfunctional organization or a dysfunctional country, because every family, organization, and country is perfectly organized to get the result that it's currently getting. So you've got to start, if you're trying to create change internally, if you're trying to get people to do something different internally, you've got to think about why things are the way they are and what are the risks that people will experience, even though you don't think they're very risky, but for other people's point of view in getting them to do something different. Right? People will be worried that they won't be competent in what you're asking them to do. People will be worried that they will disappoint. I mean, I've seen this in nonprofit life a lot, where nonprofit organizations try to do something different, and they are pushed back into their old ways by the beneficiaries of the way they've been used to doing business, the external beneficiaries and the constituents. So you've got to find a way to mobilize people either externally or internally. You've got to identify what their fears are and what their concerns are and begin to think about how you're going to deal with those. It's not going to happen because it's the right thing to do or it would already have happened that way. Does that make sense?
It does. How do you introduce performance metrics and accountability into that conversation?
Now, performance metrics and accountability are not value neutral. What you measure and how you measure it, is critical. I worked I was on the board of a workforce agency in New York for a long time, and there were huge differences about what you should measure and how you should measure it. When is a case closed? What does success look like? So I think the resistance to performance metrics is really about the question of what are we going to measure and how we're going to measure it. The only way I've seen performance metrics really work is when the people who are going to be measured participate in the process of figuring out what ought to be measured and how it will be measured. If you impose it on people, if you hire some outside contractor to develop a performance metric system, I've seen those systems fail and been fought tooth and nail. I mean, I think you can see that the best big public example is teacher accountability. Unless the people who are going to be held accountable are part of the process of designing the accountability system, it won't succeed. And my experience is that too often those are imposed on them, and then people are either fight them or figure out how to get around them and beat them. And I think that's what you saw happen in that tragedy in Atlanta, in the teacher situation. So I would start by getting the people who you want to measure and saying, how should we measure success? What does success look like to you? Let's figure out and see if we can agree on it, and make sure that it's not too low a bar. And maybe I've seen organizations who will set a a kind of aspirational bar and a minimally acceptable bar. There is a lot of interesting conversation now about measuring people against each other. Very controversial area. But for some people and some organizations, nobody wants to be in the bottom half. Everybody wants to be above average. And so in some organizations, it has been very effective to measure people against each other. That's a technique. It's a kind of accountability. In some cultures, it works very well. In some cultures, it isn't. Again, this is not one size fits all. It's about trying to figure out what is going to work in my organization. And what we're talking about now is understanding the organization and making sure that the people who are going to be held accountable are part of the process of figuring out how to do it.
So that's incredibly interesting to me, because what you're asking is you're saying that the group that needs to be measured, let's say you're a job placement agency or voc rehab or a nonprofit, that you're asking the staff to come up with, or the lay people to come up with, or maybe there's some consumer surveys for your consumers. But now let me give you a perspective that I have from looking at a lot of studies. So from looking at a lot of studies, there's two things I would like to see in the performance metrics that everybody is doing. So one of those things is that when governors see their dashboards, or when the workforce boards look at their dashboards, I don't want them only to see the unemployment number. I want them to see the workforce participation rates of people with disabilities. Why? Because frequently people with disabilities are not actively pursuing work, and therefore they're not reflected in the unemployment numbers. So by having the workforce participation numbers, it's a much better metric, and we also see that it's not improving like it is improving for women or for minorities. That's number one. Number two is I want to see more young people between the age of 16 and 24 have paid employment. So I want to know, for particularly these youth, the number of youth getting their internships, getting their real, genuine work opportunities. Those are two things that I want, because I know that the evidence shows that there is a correlation that if they have paid work experience when they're young, there's a much greater likelihood that they'll be independent in the future. So let's say I've got two things that I have on my wish list. How do I sort of manipulate that performance metric, or do I manipulate that performance criteria?
You certainly manipulate is a loaded word, but I'm perfectly comfortable with it. The two issues are different issues. And I think in order to add those to the performance metrics, you need a different game plan for each one. There's some overlap between the two, but you need a different game plan for each one. And I think it's the same kind of process that we've been talking about before. Who would benefit if people with disabilities were included in those employment statistics and broken out as a separate category? Who would benefit from that? Who would be threatened by that? Who would be against it? How can you help them with the problems that they've created, that you created for them by including the people? Because if I'm a governor, I know that you want me to include those because it's going to reduce the employment rates overall in the state. That's not good news for me, right? So you can't pretend that it's not going to do that. You've got to say to the governor or his surrogate or her surrogate, I know this is going to create a problem for you, that in the short run, this is going to produce higher unemployment numbers than otherwise would be. But I'm going to do these 14 things, not only to make that as short a run as possible, but also to protect you on several other fronts in order that the fallout from this won't be too big. So it seems to me it's the same kind of thing we're talking about. What is the problem here? What's the nature of the resistance? It's not because people are bad people. It's because there are other things that they care about. How can I help them with what they care about in order for them to do what I want them to do because it's important to me?
Right, right. Folks on the webinar, now is a good time to put in your questions because we only have 15 minutes left. But I do want to go back to this question of the youth employment and looking at the youth data. Are there any other thoughts that you have on how to approach? I mean, there are, for example, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and others, they're all about what they call opportunity youth. To them, it's all about these disenfranchised youth. In fact, Howard Schultz yesterday had a huge op-ed in the New York Times about how he's going to write a check, that's the CEO of Starbucks, who's going to help these opportunity youth with his $30 million grant get jobs. And in his head, he's thinking minority kids and kids from poor neighborhoods. How do we get those folks to say, you know what, a lot of those minority kids and a lot of those poor kids, they also might have a disability because of lead paint in their house, because their mom had an alcohol abuse, and now they have some differences disability-wise because they were born the child of a crack addict or an alcoholic, or it might be that they have autism or something that's another developmental disability. How do we get people who are only focused on these quote-unquote opportunity youth, which seems to never understand that there are other disabilities or mental health involved?
No, first of all, first thing I would do is find out what Starbucks policy is around hiring people with disabilities.
Theirs is good. Theirs is good.
Well, then I think it's easy. You know, I would just organize them to talk to Howard. You know, I don't think you're well positioned to do it. They're very well positioned to do it, right? Because they can say, look, there are people like me all over the place that can't get into the game. You're an unusual employer, and you're doing something that other employers easily could do. And now you're taking this incredible initiative with young people. It's an opportunity to extend your values into this area. You know, I think that's really set up very well. Again, he's a very smart guy. I think he wrote that with his wife, I guess, with his the co-author of that piece. And my guess is that either it hasn't occurred to him or there's some reason why this doesn't seem important to him. So there's got to be a way to bring it to his attention.
Well, interestingly, the U.S. Business Leadership Council has done a survey of who are the best employers on disability issues, and to sort of compete in it, the employers themselves had to fill out a lot of forms to prove whether or not they were good at these issues. 19 companies across America, these are Fortune 500 companies, but 19 of the Fortune 500 companies scored 100%. And Starbucks was one of those companies where their practices are really fabulous, but they aren't really happening often. In other words, you have these pockets where people are doing it quite enthusiastically and quite effectively, but I don't think that a lot of VR agencies or nonprofits are thinking, well, Starbucks, that's going to be my place of first choice yet. So I do think that looking at those 19 companies, who they are, and finding out who their Howard Schultz is, who their CEO is, could also be good for all 19 of those companies. Rachel T. asks, any suggestion for encouraging nonprofit agencies that aren't going to benefit from federal agencies and are functioning on limited budgets?
No, I think the advantages of nonprofit agencies is that they have a lot of more freedom. And so the question is, what would get them to make this more of a priority? The good news is that they're mission-driven. The bad news is that it's not your mission. It's somebody else's mission. It's their mission. It's not the mission that you care about. So how do you get this to their attention in a way that would make it non-threatening to them? It's very similar, it seems to me, to the issue of paid leave that has been on the gender equity agenda for a long time. Because nonprofit agencies have been very resistant to that on the grounds that we can't afford it. You know, our budgets are tight. We need to spend all our money on services. We can't afford shared employment. We can't afford paid leave. And so what they've done is done some research which has showed that they can actually save money by having people come back from paid leave ready to work hard rather than work around the edges. Or that in shared employment, they actually get more than 100% out of the two people sharing a job. So I think there is a factual case to be made which would actually be useful for some people in the nonprofit world. And to the best of my knowledge, that case hasn't been made in a systematic way. So that would be the first thing. Then I begin to do some of the things that we're talking about before. Who are the nonprofit agencies that are good at this, that already do it really well, and how can we have the people who are resistant experience that? How can we do what you did with the governors, which was take them to places where they can actually see a world that's beyond their imagination? Then the third thing that comes is the same idea that we talked about before, which is, if you're approaching a particular nonprofit agency that isn't very creative about hiring people with disabilities, do they have any people with disabilities on the staff? Now, if they don't have anybody on their staff, that would be a nice thing to remind people of, even in the organization, because since they think of themselves on the high moral ground, that would probably be embarrassing. If they do have people with disabilities and they are well-regarded employees, then that is a foot in the door to try to institute a broader systemic change. So again, I think it is not one size fits all, and it's not one argument fits all. It's using all the tools and not resting your chances of success on any single particular approach, but fitting what you're trying to do to the situation that you're trying to step into.
Now, Marty, we provided folks a couple of PowerPoint slides that are sort of an attachment to this if people want to download them. And when we introduced you, we had a link to your books and publications, and some of them, by the way, are very short, so they take very little time for things like thinking about, sitting on the balcony and looking down at a situation. But I am interested in sort of what's the to-do list that you're, going to want people to think about when they think about this. But I have one more question before I sort of ask you to wrap everything up, which is, for most organizations, there seems to be a high risk associated with employee disclosure of disabilities, more specifically mental health related disabilities. How do we motivate successful employees, especially those at senior levels, to disclose their disabilities so that the top management begins to understand that people with disabilities do not always equate to additional costs and problems for a company, but actually are part of the value of their existing company?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think it is a movement that needs some poster children. I mean, you do have some poster children nationally. You have the new governor of Texas is in a wheelchair. There are people in public life who have obvious disabilities. And you also are beginning to have people who are talking about having had therapy and other kinds of services which weren't discussable publicly before. So I would apply that to individual situations. That is, I think you need poster children. So when somebody who has suffered from disability, or is a person with disability who has achieved a position of senior authority in an organization, I would think a long-term campaign to get that person to out himself or herself, to use the language of the gay movement, would be really important. It's not going to solve all the problems, but as you say, it's going to make a difference in how people understand what the problem is. It's been true of women, it's been true of gays, it's been true of African Americans. It would be true of people with disabilities as well. It would be particularly interesting because the governor of Texas, I don't know anything about him, other than he's in a wheelchair, that's about all I know about him. But he's clearly not a person who is sympathetic philosophically to a big government agenda. And so rather than try to get him to be a leader in collaboration for workforce development, I would try to get him to be willing to be something of a poster child, because I think that can make a huge difference to people in ways you'd never be able to understand or pinpoint.
Right. Well, the idea of poster child is very sensitive in the disability community because of the whole Jerry Lewis telethon, pity frame. But I know that ODEP, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, has, with others, created a very nice campaign of professionals in the workplace who are, disclosing some of those issues in a very productive, professional way. Robert is asking, does he have any coordination highlights since Massachusetts is such a progressive state and has such a valued record? And actually, Robert, I'm going to push back and say something controversial. People are constantly telling me, as somebody who runs an organization that's devoted to people with disabilities, Massachusetts is the model. Massachusetts is the model. Massachusetts has such a fabulous program that I love that enables people who are quadriplegic, who are employed, to keep their personal care assistants while they're employed. So if you're quadriplegic and you want to have a job that pays $60,000 a year and still have somebody help you get dressed and ready to go to work, then you can do that in Massachusetts. But if you actually look at the performance metrics of what percentage of Massachusetts citizens with disabilities are in the workforce, its record is about tied with Mississippi and Alabama. And I think that that is an important thing for us to think about. The states that are succeeding are North Dakota and South Dakota and some other states that have maybe a 40% participation rate. But the states that are more liberal, like Massachusetts, in New York, and California, where you might think that they would have better performance metrics, have some pretty catastrophic performance metrics. So I would like to actually mention that and ask Marty how you think about that and how one could approach even looking at that.
Well, I don't think well-intentioned people in Massachusetts would like to hear what you just said. So it seems to me, obviously, the way to get them to move is to point that out to them. But it's also important to understand why that is in Massachusetts. I say this to the person who asked the question. I moved out of Massachusetts 20 years ago, so I'm pretty out of touch with what's going on. That's the question. I moved out of Massachusetts 20 years ago, so I'm pretty out of touch with what's going on there. But I'd be curious about why that is the case. Why is it that those large states, those are the states that you mentioned, are large states and liberal states, why they tend to be more at the bottom of the pack on those performance metrics than some of the smaller states. I don't have a hypothesis for it. I'd be interested.
I personally have a hypothesis. Don't know if I'm right or not, but in the presidential campaign, we're employing or utilizing the tactic of self-advocates, young people with disabilities that want work, and we're sending them out on the campaign trail to ask candidates what their plan is on these issues. So we have a young man on the autism spectrum who's very, very bright and very successful at engaging with presidential candidates. He's already had amazing conversations with Governor Kasich, but he had this very interesting one that's on our YouTube in our brand new blog that we published today, where he asked Bernie Sanders about employment for people with disabilities. And basically, Senator Sanders' reaction was, jobs for everybody are important for the dignity of Americans. But let me take some time to attack the Republicans for failing to have enough money in the disability benefits system. And so I think the frame in a lot of liberal states is to think that what people with disabilities want are more benefits. Whereas our survey of people in the disability community, and we've now done several polls, has showed that there are 30% of people with disabilities that want the benefits, and they don't want to work. Maybe they have chronic pain, or maybe they're just very happy with the way things are. But 70% want to work. So I think their perception is that people want something different. And so that's just a theory on that.
That's very interesting hypothesis. If you saw the David Brooks column in the Times today commenting on Hillary Clinton's speech, basically he was saying that the remedies that she talks about are really old liberal remedies. And what you're talking about is a different approach, which is going to challenge some of those assumptions in those very liberal states about the way to help people in need. That's great. That's great.
No doubt. No doubt. And interestingly, in her big speech, she didn't talk about people with disabilities at all, nor did she in her video launch, whereas Jeb Bush, interestingly, launched with people with disabilities in his initial campaign launch, and he and Kasich and Walker and others are going to be dealing with these per regular. We want 100% of the candidates on both sides of the aisles, obviously, to be dealing with these issues. Marty, you've been so generous with your time, and we've come to the end of our window. But, you know, as we're closing this webinar, I'd like you to close with what's your to-do list or thought process that you'd like people to have as they get off the webinar and they think about their own challenges in their jobs. What questions would you like them to ask themselves to enable them to be more successful in dealing with change, in dealing with helping people get out of their silos or to do things differently?
My experience is that people don't spend enough time in the diagnostic part of leadership, trying to understand what you're stepping into, what are the dynamics of what you're stepping into, and also trying to understand how you fit into the system. Who are you in the system? So my first piece of advice is before you leap to action, before you try to do something, spend more time, more analytic time, trying to figure out what's going on here. Why are things the way they are? And am I well positioned? In what ways am I well positioned? In what ways am I not so well positioned to step in? My experience is that if you spend a lot more time than we typically do thinking diagnostically, that will open up different ways of stepping in that were beyond your imagination before. So if there's one simple idea, it would be think harder, spend more time in deciding what it is you're stepping into.
Marty Linsky, we really appreciate your time and your leadership and the fact that you shared this with us. To those who are on the webinar, we really appreciate your time. We will be posting this along with a transcript on our website, just like we do with all of our websites, materials through YouTube. So if you know people who should have listened to this and they missed out for one reason or another, now's your chance when we put it on the website for you to share the link so that they can see this as well. Marty Linsky, thank you for your time. To those of you who listened in, we really appreciate your participation. There will be a follow-up survey, so let us know what you thought and what other topics that you're interested in. Thank you again, and we really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
This concludes today's Respectability webinar. Thank you for attending.